It's a pleasure to be here on this undeniably happy occasion, and I congratulate all the winners of this amazing prize. I hope you have a good year or more, maybe many more, writing on the strength of that. The 19th century poet John Clare said he found his poems in the fields and only wrote them down. It is not exactly what happens with me, and probably not with him. But I like the idea that a piece of writing starts with something outside coming in. When I was invited last fall to give this talk, I did say yes almost right away. But I also thought the subject proposed was very difficult. Why I write. I drew a solid blank. Although I do have a lot to say, generally speaking. A person once said to me, "You're a writer. You must have a lot to say." I've thought about his assumption many times. Is it that simple? I do have a lot to say. I have, actually, to be literal about it, an infinite amount to say. But then I imagine everyone has a lot to say, writers and non-writers alike. Can you imagine anyone not having a lot to say, even if they keep their mouth closed? I will summarize very quickly the substance of the debates that I entertained during the next weeks, and then months after I was invited to write about this. 1, I don't ever ask myself why I write. I'm a little afraid of that question. It feels safer not to ask it. I'd rather not talk or even think about why I write. I'd rather not know if there's anything to know. 2, if I have to, I'd rather talk about why other writers write. Pure speculation, or fairly pure speculation, since sometimes you at least know why they think they write something. I do so much reading. I am so often in the company of other writers and contending with at least how they write, in some cases speculating as to why certain other writers I admire, have written certain of their more puzzling books. 3, no, maybe I'd rather not talk about why other writers wrote certain of their books, but how other writers write. 4, if I talk about how other writers write, maybe I can talk about how I write. 5, or maybe I can at least talk about how I have written certain of my stories. 6, but does that in any way answer the question of why I write? 7, maybe it does, because how I write a story may show me why I wanted to write a story in the first place. 8, at least I can be pretty sure of what were not the reasons I started writing back in the beginning. I did not start writing in pursuit of fame or money. 9, I can at least look at my earliest writing self, going back to the origins of intending to write, and say that I admired certain pieces of writing and aspired to write something as fine as one of those poems or stories, for instance, or at least have the pleasure of trying. 10, yes, I know at least that I was surprised and pleased, even at age 13, by the opening pages of Beckett's Malone Dies, in which the only action is that the hero has dropped his pencil. And later by such linguistically intriguing sentences in Beckett, such as "the flagstone before her door that by dint her little weight has grooved." And I know that some years later, among many other writers, I discovered the economy and humor and firmly ethical positions of the stories of Grace Paley. And I'm pretty sure I wanted to be able to write to their high standards. 11, I can be pretty sure it is pleasure that keeps me going. There, maybe I've actually arrived at why I write. Or one reason, the pleasure of the original inspiring material, of encountering a form that I would like to write in, of handling the language, of manipulating the punctuation carefully to make it do exactly the right thing to my meaning, of seeing the story evolve, of revising, which means seeing the parts of a story or a sentence become better and better, the pleasure of seeing what the story looks like when it's done, though that pleasure is sometimes greater and sometimes less. But most importantly, the pleasure of seeing a story exist that didn't exist before. 12, I can be sure again of what are not the reasons I write a story. I don't write to convey a message. I don't write it to achieve any particular purpose. I don't write to persuade a reader of an ethical or political position of my own, though those positions certainly determine the bias of a story. I don't write a story for any particular audience. I don't think of a writer as I write, though I'm sure that after I've finished writing it, I would be glad if a reader enjoyed or was moved by it. I don't write a story to move someone. It is not that direct. It is indirect. I encounter something that moves me. I try to let a story evolve, or I guide it, into a form that fits it, that is faithful to the power or beauty of that original material. Then a reader reads the story, and if that reader is of a certain temperament, not too dissimilar to mine, he or she may be moved by the story. Being moved, however, in a sense, only in part by my story, or by my story as intermediary, as conveying what was inherent for me as I saw it, or possible in the original material. If I had had the deliberate intention of moving someone, I would be thinking more of the reader and of my own manipulative skill than of what the material itself might need in order to be fully expressed. My attention would be in the wrong place. When I am asked why I write, and I want to say for the pleasure of making a story that did not exist before, I'm thinking that it is a complicated pleasure. The pleasure is a demanding one. It inheres not just in the material of the story, the development of the story, and the result of that development, if the story turns out well, but in the demands of the writing, the demands for just the right syntax, the right balance, the right words, even for just the right spelling of the English words in all their eccentric variety. The first pleasure being the encounter with something that demands to be treated, to be formed into something. When I describe a story as beginning with something outside coming in, it is this encounter. The pleasure of the encountered material is the beginning of a story. I write something because it occurs to me to write it. It occurs to me rather than I going out in search of it. It is in some sense found in a field. It may be an involuntary idea of my own, or it may be material that is actually outside me, a companionable bug, or a stately cow, or the strangeness of the word organized when used for a tropical storm, or an emphatic human being saying something unexpected overheard on a train. This material presents itself and makes me want to see it expressed in a form that is just right. I then go forward writing it blindly, in a sense, or guided by a part of my mind not quite under my control. I do not stop to look forward toward the end of the story, and certainly not toward its meaning. If I imposed a purpose on the story, the life would go out of it. Pleasure is one emotion at the origin of a story, but other emotions come in. The emotion can be strong or mild. It can be horror or anger or amusement. I often relish human behavior, and I am also often horrified by it. I relish the behavior of animals and insects and even minerals and the phenomena of physics. I am bemused and a little in awe when I see how long a shadow is cast by the nearly horizontal afternoon sunlight from a single grain of salt on the kitchen counter. In another story which takes place on the same counter, I am sympathetic to a little bug that runs away from my sponge and feel affection as I imagine, or don't imagine, but know, that the bug has business elsewhere. He may simply have forgotten it for a moment until my sponge shoved him suddenly, inadvertently, and off he went. The first pleasure came from the sight of the bug, but further pleasure came from choosing to write the word business in relation to the bug. But I have respect for bugs, so I hope the story did not seem condescending. Other things in our world may anger and frustrate me or make me despair. Those emotions rarely come out directly in a story. They simply continue to abide inside me, having matured deep into my bones over time. They may come out indirectly in a story or not at all, but if I read it later, I can see that they lie somewhere beneath or behind the story or in its very fabric. How could they not, since they are part of what I am, and the story is coming from me? I wrote a story called The Cows. I did not write it with any intention. I did not even write it all at once. It took 3 years to accumulate. It was as simple as looking out the window or standing by the road, looking across the road and observing the cows, who over the years started by being 3 heifers, then grew up and bore 2 calves. After some time, the 2 calves, once they were also grown up, were taken away. I wrote down what I saw occasionally. After 3 years, I had 80-some observations. I made a little book of it with accompanying photos. Only later did I realize that the emotions behind this story were not only my various forms of pleasure in the positions and behaviors of the cows and their calves, and the setting down of my observations of them, but also my pain and sorrow over the treatment of most cows in the world. I could see what these cows, my neighbor cows, preferred when given almost complete freedom, which they had, to go in and out of their barn, to drink from a bathtub by the fence, to walk to a particular spot in their large field, in winter to stand still in the snow in the warm sun. Even when they were larger than their mothers, the calves went on nursing. A few tugs at the teat now and then, and their mothers stood still and waited. All I wanted to do in writing the piece called The Cows was portray the individuality of these cows and their choices, to record them as they looked, black on green or white, in the field. Intellectual delight at certain kinds of language is another emotion. I am moved by the manipulation of language, what I can do with it and what other writers do with it. I am reading all the time, and I am reading all the time that I am in the midst of writing something. And I probably constantly learn more nuances of more things about writing, about ways of writing, or have lessons imprinted more deeply in me from what I read, especially since I do a lot of analyzing when I read, especially of what creates the style or tone of a book that pleases me, or of a book that I dislike. If a pattern or rhythm pleases me greatly, it is likely to remain imprinted on me somewhere and come out at some point in something I write. I may choose consciously to use a form I have encountered in a piece of writing by someone else, but I may also have imprinted on me a pattern or rhythm from a piece of writing by someone else. Why am I so enraptured by a book I am reading these days, James Baldwin's No Name in the Street? It may be his company, his voice, and the invitation of his narrative style that caused me to pick up the book again and again, even though I was not intending to read another book of his right now, and there are other books I'm supposed to be reading. Is it the plainness of his word choices or their precision, or is it the clarity and balance of his sentences, or the way he uses repetition to take us from one phrase to the next, or his restrained or unrestrained passion? At one point in the book, though in general he uses metaphor sparingly, he was evidently angry enough during the incident or afterwards in the writing to go to a metaphorical extreme. Here he is portraying a woman whose hostility he has had to confront in a restaurant where he is not welcome. He describes her as having, quote, a face like a rusty hatchet and eyes like 2 rusty nails, nails left over from the crucifixion. I am arrested by the image. I stop reading forward and read again what I've just read and start figuring out how Baldwin manipulated the syntax and word choices to make this image even more powerful. And I don't say every choice is conscious. These choices, I'm interested in what their effect is. Why does he repeat nails, like two rusty nails, nails left over? Why does he not say the second part all at once, eyes like two rusty nails left over from the crucifixion? I think he repeats nails because of the pace he wants for the sentence, so that first we have a chance to absorb on its own the arresting image of the two rusty nails before he makes the image even more devastating. Another reason to repeat it may be to convey the sense that he himself stopped at rusty nails and then had a further thought about the crucifixion. And why does he say left over from the crucifixion rather than just two rusty nails from the crucifixion? There are probably several answers. The words left over may make the crucifixion and the hammering together of the cross all more physically real for us. But also the words left over may suggest a thing for which another use could be found, that after the nails were used to crucify Jesus of Nazareth, they could be employed over and over again for other handy, vicious purposes, perhaps every time such hatred as this woman felt was expressed. The word bother came into my life in a specific positive sense quite recently when I read an interview given by John Ashbery some years ago in which he talked about how he encountered the source of his long poem, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, and especially the title. He says that he first encountered the painting by the young Francesco Parmigianino in the form of a reproduction in a magazine, and the title bothered him. He then, years later, encountered the actual painting in a museum in Vienna, and it bothered him again. It bothered him until he, quote, did something about it. And he uses the word bother in this way in this interview about at least one other thing that inspired a poem. I encountered the Ashbery interview in the midst of the time when I was beginning to struggle to answer the question of why I write, and I saw that this could be a very concise, truthful answer to the question. The reason why I write a particular story may be because something, which I call material, as in raw material, bothers me until I do something about it. In these cases, the word bother is wholly positive. The cows bothered me. The shadow of the grain of salt bothered me. Back in the winter when I was thinking about both why and how other writers write and was tempted to write only about other writers, I was reading a book by George Sturt from early in the 20th century called The Wheelwright's Shop. As I was reading the book, which took me some months, and after I was done reading it, it remained in my mind to bother me. It posed the question of why exactly I went on reading it. Sturt's book bothered me because his motivation for writing it was, to my mind, so pure. The most elementary or direct reason to write a book, because you cared enough about the subject and had enough to say about the subject to write about every aspect of it, no matter how few readers would be interested. Sturt did not court an audience, though he implies possible readers and their attention. He asks himself in reference to the hanging the wheels on an axle, shall I tell how the arms were finally fixed in the axle bed, and how that was fixed to the body with clips and clip pins, to say nothing of tail pins? It isn't interesting enough, perhaps. More interesting is to note how the axle bed, ready at last, was lightly shaved up with the draw shave wherever possible. And the whole book is like this. I went on reading it, even though he went into such detail about nothing much more than everything one could say about building a wagon or a dung cart. Perhaps I went on because of what I learned that was new to me, as for instance about a blacksmith not wishing to admit sunlight into his shop because it hindered him from seeing the intensity of his fire. Or that a carter might ask him for a slight modification to suit a special horse or a special bit of hilly road. In this exhaustiveness and fixation, Sturt's book resembled another book I had been steadily reading, though with long intermissions as I gathered the will to launch into it again. J.A. Baker's The Peregrine, which is really just as narrow in subject matter. There's one setting, the estuary. The figures animating the scene are rarely human beings, but mainly birds, the central figures being raptors. The weather plays a part in the landscape. Nothing much happens except what you would expect of the water, the clouds, the sun rising and setting, and the birds, which fly up or down or out over the water or land in a tree, remain sitting on a branch, clean themselves, sleep, tear apart their prey. Maybe my interest was sustained in both books by two qualities that are primary for me in a book. The author's character as it comes through, in other words, the company you keep for the quite long time it takes to read a book, especially a book with nothing at all you would ordinarily call plot or suspense or even argument. The other quality is the skill and beauty of the style of writing itself in both these books, particularly the sensitivity to sound and the high level of exactness. Sturt's exactness requires and draws on a wide specific vocabulary, but not much metaphor. Baker's, as he describes again and again a bird's flight or feathers or the changing weather, depends on not only descriptions of fine shades of difference, but one apt metaphor after another. Here is an example that plays gently on the sounds of the words while pairing a simile and a metaphor. Quote, 5 minutes later, he lifted into air again, circling, gliding, diving up to brightness, like a fish cleaving up through warm blue water, far from the falling nets of the starlings. Both books seemed to be guided only by the author's interest, without any concern that they might be crossing the line into tedious. Most of my stories are not tedious, but not all of them. A story may turn out to be tedious if it needs to be, or at least one of them did, Letter to the Foundation. This story is narrated by a character who is herself tedious, very repetitious about some things that are worrying her to do with spending money. And although the problems are interesting in themselves, the long-winded story she tells goes on as she circles back more than once. Let her be tedious, I thought. That's the way she is. The other instance I can think of is not a story, but my quite long essay about learning Norwegian. To me, it is the opposite of tedious, but that is to me. I'm the one who wanted to write it. In this case, willing to be exhaustive like George Sturt and his wagons, I could not leave out the smallest detail about how I learned Norwegian, which was by opening to the first page and beginning to read a book in Norwegian. No dictionary, no grammar book, no teacher. Because the experience excited and fascinated me so, it was important to me to record it, just as the great skill refined over the centuries that was required to make a good and lasting wagon, suited to the roads it was to travel on, even to the width of the ruts of those country roads, mattered to Sturt, who knew it intimately, since the shop was his own, though he himself had only some of the skills of wagon making, as he makes clear, but was a skilled writer. Sometimes, like Sturt, I write to record a particular experience, or maybe even more accurate would be to say not just to record, but to replicate, to relive through the writing of it, the experience I had. in the case of learning Norwegian, like jumping into a cold, clear, deep body of water, maybe the pool in a disused quarry, without knowing how to swim, and yet swimming. At the time when I thought I might write about how other writers wrote, I went beyond contemplating writers who were willing to risk being tedious, and thought about the work of writers who were possibly difficult for some readers in other ways, and similarly willing to be peculiar, to be strange, to write about a certain subject or in a certain way, no matter what, which to me is a sign of an essential dedication or single-mindedness, such as Robert Musil's extended, unfinished The Man Without Qualities, or Walter Benjamin's Arcades Project, or the still strange to us poems of Emily Dickinson with her willful incongruities and native eccentricity, or the Gray Notebook, the diary of the Catalan Josep Pla, who took the slim record he had made as a young man of just a year or two of his life and spent the next 50 years annotating and elaborating on it to create the thick book he finally published. Or Elizabeth Smart's novel By Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept. In some parts, the book's strange and ever-changing prose is dense with impossible or elusive metaphors, such as, on her mangledness I am spreading my amorous sheets, or shame copulates with every September housefly. In another part, in exquisite juxtaposition, the questions posed by a border policeman questioning the morality of her behavior alternate with quotations from the Song of Solomon, heard only in her mind. What relation is this man to you? My beloved is mine, and I am his. He feedeth among the lilies. How long have you known him? I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He feedeth among the lilies. Did you sleep in the same room? Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair, thou hast dove's eyes. In the same bed? Behold, thou art fair, my beloved, yea, pleasant. Also, our bed is green. The subject matter was outrageous at the time, especially to Elizabeth Smart's mother, who appears in the book and was so horrified by the book about her daughter's love affair with a married man, her daughter who at first shared this man with his wife, and then took this man for herself, who had children by him, that she managed to persuade her native Canada, she knew some powerful people, to ban the book's publication there, and then acquired all the copies she could and had them burned. Deep in the book, in a metaphor that rivals Baldwin's, Smart describes this difficult mother as having, quote, eyes like medieval wild men in her head. When I decided that I could try to answer the question of why I write by looking at why I write certain stories, I saw that, like the tedious woman in my story, The Foundation, I write also sometimes to figure out something I don't understand. That material outside me, or inside me, but coming to me as though found in a field, in this case as a sudden perception, does more than just bother me as something to which I want to give a form. It is something I don't fully understand and that I want to understand. A story may then evolve from that. Perhaps I think that putting a thought into a formal piece of writing may help me understand a puzzle. Here is an example of how a story evolved. It started with the death of a woman I did not know very well. Her death caused me to have some complex thoughts that were new to me about what is lost when someone dies. It was the very fact that I did not know her well that caused me to have these thoughts, since they were not complicated by any long or deep attachment to her. She was an elderly friend of the elderly mother of a friend of mine in my village. I had first met her at a one-time local gathering, long in the organizing, called the Jewish Farmers' Reunion, which she attended because her family had had a chicken farm on the outskirts of our village. My friend and I attended because we were interested in all things having to do with local history. The second time I saw her was when the four of us had dinner together one night at the residence where she and my friend's mother lived, across the river in an upscale assisted living place with tablecloths and waitstaff and wine. I enjoyed the dinner and the company and looked forward to more dinners, to crossing the river again in my friend's car to see the two old women. I decided my new acquaintance would be my youthful old aunt, with her sense of humor, her kindness, her sharpness and poise, her fund of memories of the old days in the village. Then, within months of that night, she fell seriously ill with a condition that would require painful and protracted treatment. She chose instead to refuse treatment and just let herself go. She was gone within weeks. I felt the loss personally, but I also perceived what a loss of an enriched mind her death was. That mind of hers, which had developed over a lifetime to what it was, through childhood on the farm, her young womanhood, her marriage and her motherhood, her maturity, and the rich and lively friendships of old age, to become as complex and surprising as it now was. That mind was now shut down, eliminated, gone forever in a moment at her death. And immediately upon her death, the parts of her brain in particular that contained the memories of my village would soften and degenerate quite quickly. There was not only sadness, but also amazement for me in thinking about all this. The same wonder we return to habitually whenever we recognize that our apparently disembodied thoughts are not disembodied, but quite physically located somewhere within our brains. We even know the approximate locations, shooting around as electrical impulses. And then I associated these thoughts with what went on in my own brain, which still had blood flowing through it and electricity, including my constant attempts all my life to improve my German, for no particular reason. The German in my brain was better now than it had been in my 20s or my 40s. The thought of those constant efforts, which seemed to me funny and a little pathetic, now came together with my thoughts about the end of my elderly friend, which had not been funny. There was a third element at the origin of this little story. It had a model, a poem I have read for decades now, a folk poem translated by the poet Anselm Hollow from the Cheremiss language. I had read it repeatedly because, in the same sense as Ashbery's experience with the painting by Parmigianino, this poem had bothered me for a long time. It puzzled me because it was a piece of writing that remained surprising to me, though I knew it well. But how did it do that? It is only 3 lines long, untitled, translated from the Cheremiss by Anselm Hollow. I shouldn't have started these red wool mittens. They're done now, but my life is over. What a small poem. But as with other short and simple pieces of writing, and long and complex ones too, of course, there is the surface sense of it and then more beneath the surface. In this case, the fact that whatever our projects may be, that life comes to an end, we come to an end, or that our projects consume our life and then we die, or that we spend our life on activities that may turn out to have used up our life pointlessly. This poem gave me a pattern for the beginning of my story, but then my story continued in a slightly different direction. Improving my German. All my life, I have been trying to improve my German. At last, my German is better. But now I am old and ill. I will die soon. But when they take me to my grave, I will have, somewhere in my brain, better German. So all that pondering and trying to accept or articulate something I had not fully comprehended before resulted in a very short story A very short story that nevertheless had a lot of thinking behind it, and then a lot of revision to arrive at it, and an upcropping within it of the humor that I perceived in my own relationship to German, but that did not exist in the original situation that so struck me and led me to thoughts, my only initial response to which seemed useless, saying to myself of the loss of my friend's mind, what a waste. Giving form to an aspect of my puzzlement and sadness, even though it did not mention my friend or her death, helped to relieve me of my feelings by transmuting them into the solidity of a piece of writing. It relieved me, too, of my amusement at my attempts to learn German. For amusement, too, likes to be relieved. So it must be that relieving myself of the burdens of strong feelings by taking them out of myself and putting them into an objective form, a form that can be also shared by others out in the world, is yet another reason why I write. Thank you.